All right, y'all. So we're starting our new unit today. We just finished the test on Unit 1A, the Renaissance, and now we're going to go right into Unit 2, the Reformation and Wars of Religion. This is absolutely one of my favorite units when we look at the social, political, and economic elements. But before we get started, I do want to just define the Protestant Reformation in less than 30 words. You see that in your notes. So, what was the Protestant Reformation in less than 30 words? All right, are y'all ready? All righty. The Protestant Reformation was from the time period 1517 to 1648, where protesters against the Pope transformed modern Europe religiously, socially, and politically. Again, I'll repeat that. So the Protestant Reformation was a time period from between 1517 and 1648 where protesters against the Pope transformed modern Europe religiously, socially, and politically. Really important that as we kind of do this, this is going to be primarily, and the first part of this unit is really going to be more focused on the religious elements of the Protestant Reformation. And then we're, of course, going to shift to the political at the outcome with the wars of religion. So, with that said, let's look here. The big claim for today's lesson. Go ahead and write that down. If you need a pause, you can pause. But we're going to talk about the environment that created the need for religious reformation was established by corruption of the Renaissance papacy, the emergence of Christian humanism, emergence of nationalism, and the rise of merchants. So as we're kind of focused on what creates this environment or what were the causes, I'm really going to try to whittle it down to these four areas that you'll be able to understand and hopefully be able to apply. So let's go ahead and jump in. The corruption of the Renaissance papacy. This is a really important element. The word corruption just means you're no longer doing what your original purpose, right? We know that the Pope was supposed to be the head of the church and the spiritual leader of Western Europe / Christendom. That's kind of our discussion of that. But in our argument in today's lesson, we're going to see that there's going to be a transition from religiousness to political corruption as well as social corruption of the popes. Now, it really starts out with the beginning of the end of the late Middle Ages. There was a time period called the Great Schism. Everybody underline the word schism. Schism, just for our definition, is to be a division within a religion. A division within a religion. Schisms can be political and other elements, but for our class, we're just going to focus on this. So the Great Schism was during the 14th and 15th century, in which there's two competing popes. In reality, it goes all the way up to 5. We're not going to talk about those, but I just want to point out that during the Great Schism, Europe is going to be divided into two competing popes. One pope lived in Avignon, France. The other pope lived in Rome. And their goals were to re-centralize Christendom under their authority. The Great Schism actually turned into a European-wide war. It's a component of it was found in the 100 Years' War that we don't need to talk about. But the whole element here, I just want to point out at this moment, what has happened to the absolute power of the Pope? If it's divided, it's no longer absolute. And it gave a window for heresy. Heresy, that word heresy just means questioning church doctrine. And there's two heretics we need to know. The first is John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an English leader who was the first to translate a Bible into English, maybe just the New Testament, but the idea he's translating. John Wycliffe is in the midst of this, in the middle part of the Great Schism, late 14th century. And he begins to say, we need reform. We need to reform the church. We need to reform the clergy. We need to fix what is right with the church. The Pope is not supposed to have absolute power. We as people should have access to the reading of the Bible. It should be held hostage by the clergy. Well, John Wycliffe becomes like this English hero during the Hundred Years' War, and people in England began to think, this is kind of cool. Before I leave this point, I just want to point out John Wycliffe is protected two ways. A, geographically he's protected. He's way far away from Rome. He's in England. But he's also protected by the Great Schism. The popes who are fighting each other, they did not have time to punish him. Unfortunately, the next one, a little bit differently. John Huss was a Bohemian religious leader. Bohemia is basically in Austria, which is in Eastern or Central Europe. And the Bohemians had been impacted by Wycliffe because an English princess had married into the Bohemian family. And now all of a sudden, she taught John Huss and others about the teachings of John Wycliffe. And John Huss is like, oh my gosh, this is the time for us to shine. And he began to challenge the church as well. Unfortunately for John Huss, geographically, he was located really close to the Pope. And secondly, unfortunately, the Great Schism was coming to an end. So now all of a sudden, how many popes do we have? One pope. And John Huss, who is challenging the teachings of the Pope, challenging the Catholic Church, trying to get them back to become more of what it originated as a spiritual house. John Huss was invited to discuss to the Pope, and as he was invited, he was captured and burned at the stake. I sometimes call John Huss's burning the Bohemian barbecue because as he was being barbecued away, we always say, don't eat the meat at the Bohemian barbecues. But outside of that, John Huss is burned at the stake. And what happens to medieval heresy? Are we going to see a reform of the church or no longer reforms? And the answer really short is it brings a really halt to any honest approach to reforms. And the church's reaction, Huss is burned at the stake as a heretic. The Pope eventually reemerges as the absolute leader of the Renaissance church and Christendom. And now all of a sudden the Pope is going to becomes a reactionary leader who refused to accept any challenges. So very quickly we're seeing the corruption here. We see the idea that Europe was divided in half. We see as it was divided in the Great Schism between these competing popes, Wycliffe introduced heresy or challenging church doctrine. And John Huss, unfortunately, is going to be the one that is punished as he's burned at the stake. And that Pope is going to eventually turn into the absolute leader. And this is going to be the last slide for this part. But this is where we see papal corruption. Alexander VI and his debauchery. We've already talked a little bit about this Pope. We've talked about how Alexander VI was a sexual being who may have pimped his daughter out for political gain. He allowed for one son to murder another son. And then we know that Alexander VI's son, Caesar, attempted to centralize the Italian state. And Alexander VI in the 1490s into 1500 said, amen, this is good. And we know it was significant because later Machiavelli wrote about it. And this is where he drove his elements that we've already talked about. But Alexander VI, debauchery, sex, alcohol, but no one was able to question him because what kind of power did he have? Absolute. A little bit later, we have Pope Julius II. Julius II is really important because he's the one that ordered Machiavelli to paint the Sistine Chapel. Give us our time frame there. But Julius II, according to your textbook, was the warrior pope. So instead of spiritual reasons leading, he literally led troops into killing others during the Italian Wars. So Julius II abandoned his religious leadership for political leadership, and that's why he was called the warrior pope. I don't think Julius II actually thought anything was wrong. He had no idea this was corrupt, but instead of overseeing the religious, he actually called for the killing of other Catholics. And my favorite one is, we're going to talk a lot about him, is Pope Leo X. He's the Medici Pope or the Medici Pope. He was the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And he I always like to say, at this point, the Medici realized they couldn't change the paradigm, so they joined it. And here, Leo X, he's going to focus most of his attention on the building of things like the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel, and he's going to utilize church resources to really create Rome as the cultural center of the world. And remember, this is before Leo is going to be in 1517. We're going to see that later. So as you begin to see this, we're really kind of moving here, and clearly the hope for reform by the heretics failed. And now we have this Pope who has absolute power, who is unquestionable, and they're no longer using their position to serve Jesus or the church, but they're there to serve for their own personal beings, be it their desire of their flesh, political desires, or artistic. I'm going to pause here to let you guys think about that.